afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In the series on sociology of India, in today's lecture we are going to discuss on the discourse and debates on caste in India. Now when we try to understand caste, which is a very common word, familiar, most of us are familiar either in terms of a commonsensical understanding of what is caste or what is a caste system, and also we have a sociological understanding. So when we look into the study of caste in India, we need to first understand that caste implies difference. It implies a kind of a scripted status which was assigned to individual by virtue of birth. And then you had this understanding of caste system in Indian society, which was in terms of highlighted as a society which was based on inequality, hierarchy and stratification. So though we are very familiar with this, it's a very important concept for understanding society in India. What is important is to understand how the study of caste has been carried out in India ever since, say, even in the primitive society to the colonial period, and even today it's being debated and discussed. So if we try to understand through the evolutionary and historical methods or approach to the study of caste in India, we see that there is a lack of clarity in terms of understanding the origin of caste, or also in terms of understanding the features of caste system in India. When we look into the kind of origin, we see there are several theories. Some of the theories are like it's a ritual origin in terms of trying to understand the origin of caste system in terms of the different parts of the body of Hindu god, or we have a racial theory of caste system. We also have an endogamous theory which explains in terms of how the caste, in order to retain the purity of a group, it was based on the idea of marrying within a group. We also have occupational theory and so on. So there is no kind of a uniform explanation or theory of how the system emerged. In terms of features, we see that G.S. Ghurye, he gave us 6 features, and whereas if we go back to other theorists, some of them have given 5 features. Srinivas tells us it is 5. He doesn't look into religious and civil disability. Bogle looks into only 3 features in terms of hereditary, hierarchy and specialization. And further, if we look into other studies, they kind of reduced, B.R. Ambedkar reduced it only into terms of endogamy. So how do we look into it? One of the way in which it has been conceptualized in contemporary society, because of the interlinkages with politics, with identity, is to understand the emergence of Dalit consciousness. But then it kind of also looks into it that this is an identity built around a particular group in terms of access to certain resources. These resources could be political or economy. So trying to understand its caste or caste system in India is theoretically problematic. So what we do in this lecture is try to understand some of the ways in which caste has been studied in the Indian context. So as we are familiar with the idea that one of the ways in which Indian society has been studied is to start with the system of caste. Whether we go into, say, school books or any graduation syllabus or higher studies, we see that every syllabus would have the category of caste and the several readings on caste. So we started with the whole idea of comparing caste with class. So caste was kind of diametrically opposed to class. Caste as something which was described as closed and class as something as open. This way of conceptualizing caste fitted well into the idea of the binary opposition between the West as civilized and India as kind of developing or still in the need for development. So when we begin with this whole idea, say a very basic book on caste would tell us that caste is actually to be conceptualized in terms of varna. So most of us kind of look into this idea, the similarity between caste and varna, or the difference between caste and varna. Whether we talk about Srinivas or other Indian sociologists, they were grappling with the idea to explain caste and varna system, and where it was by identified by several authors that varna was a fourfold classification of the society, and it did not include the fifth category, which was basically the untouchables. So then there was also the functional theory, which I would say that it is the jati which is the functional unit. So the varna is just a model. It just tells us a neat, clear description of the Indian society into these four categories, whereas in everyday reality, the interaction between people is at the level of jati. The whole idea of how we looked into caste has kind of come in from the understanding of British scholars who kind of attributed the construction of caste as a category for understanding society. So several literature refer to caste as a colonial construct. Dirks kind of says that it was a kind of system that became very significantly relevant in terms of understanding the classification of society on basis of certain attributes like hierarchy, stratification, inequality. Now, when we shift from colonial period to the post-independent period and try to conceptualize the study of caste, we see a number of literature moves from the understanding caste as a religious institution to caste as a secular institution. So basically the whole idea was to kind of make it more contemporary by making caste as part of the larger process of social change. And there were theories which were looking into the evolution approach, or were looking into the historical approach, which again fits into India society, moving from a traditional society, from a caste-based society to a modern society to a class-based society. And therefore, the argument that came in is that despite this process of economic political change, caste continues to be relevant, not necessarily with the whole idea of the pollution and purity, or not so much in terms of commensality or interdining, but more in sense of the negotiations which has occurred around politics, around the idea of identity, and around the question of numbers and dominance. So there has been a shift from a religious approach to a secular approach. Now, when we look into the way in which caste has been conceptualized in sociology and by other social scientists, we kind of tend to look into the three ways. One is to look in it as caste and objective reality, which kind of starts off with the colonial construction of caste, and then we move to understanding caste as a subjective reality, and then the third way would be to look into the both objective and subjective reality. So when we go into understanding caste as an objective reality, we see that it was explained or comprehended by giving certain clear-cut identifiable features or characteristics. So initially, say in the beginning of 19th century, any book which was kind of explaining what is caste system would tell you that caste system is a system which has these following features. If we pick up Gurre's Caste and Race, it tells us the six features in terms of the idea of hierarchy, occupational segregation, limitations on your choice of occupation, on the idea of restrictions on marriage, and so on and so forth. So most of these were kind of looking into caste as an object with certain attributes like external features which could help us understand caste as an institutions. So if we will look into the features, we kind of found that it was a universal institution. It was out there to be observed, to be kind of identified by researchers and scholars, and there was some amount of regional variation, but overall you had a universal uniform feature of it, and therefore you had this Varna model. So all these features which kind of explained what a caste system was empirically observable, and it helped to understand caste as a system of stratification. So when we look into the works which has kind of looked into it as an objective reality, the most relevant work that comes to mind is Dumont and Pocock, and even the second, all these Orientalist scholars like Marriott and Inden, and they were kind of explaining caste as a reality which helped to understand Indian society. So they were most of these studies were kind of a book view which was based on reading mythology, on existing literature, and they identified caste as a Hindu attribute and very unique to India, because it was only here where they could find such a system based on inequality and appropriation. So then we look into second work which is very significant, is which I have already talked in the lecture, is G.S. Ghurye. G.S. Ghurye is kind of giving us the 6 features. Number 1, segmental division of society. Number 2, hierarchy, which is you are ranking the caste in an order. Those who are kind of doing more religious occupations, more pure occupations are on the high rank, like the Brahmins, and you rank them depending on the occupations that the group is doing. The third is restriction on feeding and social intercourse, civil and religious disabilities, and privilege of different sections, like some of them had more access to resources. For instance, if you read the earlier works on caste, it would kind of give us this description that the lower caste did not have access to the temple, they did not have access to the common pool of water, they were staying on the margins of this residents were on the margin of the village. So these were some of the ways in which privilege or lack of privilege was explained, and most important feature was explained was in terms of endogamy or restriction. The choice of whom one could marry was determined by the birth in a particular caste. So we kind of help into understanding this as an objective reality. Soon there is a shift from understanding caste and an objective reality to caste as a subjective reality. And when we look into the subjective reality, it implies that there is no such kind of a universal or uniform feature, but the experience of the group or individual in the hierarchy would determine what it is. So we started kind of identifying different ways in which caste was understood. So the earlier studies were identified as a top-bottom approach, where because it was based on the Brahminical point of view, so it was based on reading Hindu text, and it was in terms of interaction with Brahmins. So it was seen as a system which was kind of occupational ranking, and there was a kind of interdependence and reciprocity. But soon there were kind of an emergence of the experience of the lower caste, and the bottom up approach came in, where you need to look into caste not in terms of interdependence, but in terms of exploitation, in terms of denial of certain basic rights, in terms of not having certain privilege which was enjoyed by the other. So Bogle identified 3 tendencies, namely repulsion, hierarchy, and hereditary specialization. So these 3 kind of features would help us to understand that the subjective experience of caste would vary from place to place, or even in terms of the individual position in the caste. So when we look into repulsion, it was kind of looking into the Dumont's concept of pollution and purity. So the pollution and purity concept, which was given by Dumont, was explaining caste as a part of the religious institution, where the distance between the upper caste, who were kind of labeled as pure, and the lower caste, who were labeled as impure by certain standards, because they were not involved in doing any kind of religious activity, reading the Vedas or the text, and that became a ground to repel them from the mainstream society. So this opposition between the pure and impure, or pollution and purity, became very significant in terms of understanding caste. So when we look into the third way of understanding caste, was to look into the unity of subjective and objective. That is, you cannot kind of segregate the two. Like when we say that caste as an objective reality has these features has been arrived in terms of the experience. Either it is the experience of the upper caste, or it is the experience of those placed in the lower hierarchy. So when we look into caste as a system of structure, objective reality becomes important to see the hierarchy is a feature of caste. So when you need to see how this hierarchy is working at the empirical level, so you need to combine the objective reality with the subjective reality. So caste as a reality does not subsume experience and humiliation. You have a certain kind of legitimate understanding of how this hierarchy or segregation worked, and the structure or the interpersonal relations of individuals in the society are shaped according to those identifiable features. So then it kind of assumes that those who are placed lower in the hierarchy will suffer humiliation, will suffer exploitation. So there is a kind of the existential reality coming from the ideological understanding of caste. So the whole idea was that there is a way in which it was understood. Those who were looking at it in terms of experience of the group which was denied certain access to resources kind of saw it as an extreme form of stratification, and the kind of based on extreme inequality between groups based on wealth and political power. Then we look into this whole idea of caste as a subject of study, and as already discussed, it's important to see how it became a very important popular term during the colonial rule, and it becomes kind of identified as a colonial construct where caste was seen as a vehicle for reproduction of unequal relation, as a social institution legitimizing economic exploitation, and as a source of social exclusion, guilty of producing a highly segmented society. So this kind of conceptualization actually can be placed within the discourse in which, you know, it was not only in terms of understanding India as a object, but also in terms of creating a hierarchy of ideas where India was kind of considered as a society which was based on inequality, stratification, and therefore required a reform or kind of revolution, and therefore it gave a higher position to the Western thought. So Nicholas Dirks has argued that it was under the British rule that caste became a single term capable of expressing, organizing, and above all systemizing India's diverse form of social identity, community, and organization. One of the reasons that we need to go into such a discourse is also to understand the context in which such a discourse was being produced, and that is kind of the colonial hegemony, which was not only in terms of political control but also in terms of implementing ideas which were kind of considered as dominating over the way in which India's social cultural milieu was understood. Now, if we look into Surinder Jodhkar's work on caste in contemporary India, he identifies three conceptual categories for understanding caste system, and that is not kind of a much difference in terms of understanding caste as objective reality, subjective reality, but it kind of helps us to just categorize or identify the various periods or various epochs in which caste has been understood. So, caste as tradition, caste as power politics, and caste as humiliation. So, these trajectories help to traverse through the ways in which caste has been comprehended in Indian society. These are not mutually exclusive, but only points at different modes of social scientific engagement. So, it's not that these are happening at three different places or they kind of give us completely different ways of understanding. It's just kind of problematizing the difficulty in comprehending caste and caste system in India. So, when we look into the first, which is caste as tradition, we know that the whole idea of looking into caste as a rich part of the religion of Hindu society starts off kind of getting organized and systematic within the colonial period. And lot of documentation of what is caste system, what are the features of caste system, started off by Western scholars who kind of was in the attempt to kind of identify India as a very peculiar situation with having this caste system. So, the Western view of caste evolved over a period of time through the Orientalist, missionary and administrators. Now, these three ways of understanding Indian society has been discussed in the previous lecture on the sociology of India. So, now trying to understand caste as tradition takes us back to the idea of Asian civilization, India as a Hindu civilization, and again there is a kind of historical evolutionary mapping where certain periods of Indian society are compared and contrasted, and therefore there is this idea that as the society is moving from one epoch to the other, things are becoming different. So, caste becomes more as a question of inequality. However, there is a kind of a lack of clarity in terms of the ways in which caste practiced or existed as an institution in the pre-colonial time. So, in the Orientalist discourse, India was depicted as static, timeless, spaceless, and this depiction of Indian society as timeless, static was based on the understanding of caste as a system of inequality or closed stratification. By late 19th century, British came to believe that caste was the foundational fact of Hindu society. India was different from other society on the account of caste system. So, for them, India becomes a excellent area of study because they found something very unique to India and something that needed to be discussed and debated. Another level of comparison was again when we looked into the Western society and the Eastern society, there was a lot of comparison which was done, the comparative method in terms of giving us this binary oppositions between the civilized and the uncivilized, the open society, the closed society, in which we then had caste and class, and caste was kind of seen as ascribed status and class was seen as an achieved status. So, it was within this evolutionary comparative framework that such a discourse on caste emerged. Then we also look into the ways in which Western industrial society was portrayed as open. And therefore, when you are kind of comparing and creating this opposition, if West was open, if West was model, the opposite would come in to describe India. So, India was described as closed, India was described as uncivilized and further needed progression. So, the third level of comparison was in terms of the individualistic versus collective. So, in the Western society, 19th century Reformation, Renaissance, industrialization were kind of creating a discourse of society as moving towards individualistic society, and then India was seen, and with reference to caste system and village, it was identified as a collective society. and theories of industrialization, social change, then gave us this idea that Indian society was moving from a caste-based society to a class-based society. The most important thinker which comes into mind when we look into the study of caste is Louis Dumont, and his book, The Homo Hierarchicus. It was kind of considered as a relevant text in understanding the society in India, but it needs to keep in mind that he had this comparative method and he was comparing India with the West. So much of his identification of caste system was based in terms of identifying terms which were not found in the Western society. So in his work Homo Hierarchicus, Dumont shows India as hierarchical compared to the egalitarian society of the West. In India, inequality was seen as a cultural fact. Why cultural fact? Because it was seen as originating from religion and therefore legitimate and valued mode of social organization. Inequalities of status and hierarchy was kind of considered more significant compared to the secular concept. So you had this idea that the Brahmin was more significant than the king because Brahmin had religious power and the king had secular power. So when we look into the idea of caste from a comparative perspective, we see this idea of the theorization of caste built around the notion of caste in terms of what was absent in the Western society. Then we also have caste as power, which is Weber's theory of hierarchy and status. For Weber, caste hierarchies were relations of power relations, and this we will understand when we look into identity politics in the contemporary discourse. So Srinivas also used this concept of caste as power when he uses the concept of dominant caste in terms of numerical numbers, political power, and also a higher status in the secular hierarchy. So and there are other theories who looks into the idea of caste as power, which is Andre Bette's study, which looks into caste as a hierarchical system. And then we look into the third approach, which is humiliation and discrimination. This idea of humiliation and discrimination that defines caste system will develop in the later part of the 20th century when there is a lot about identity in terms of looking into authority, domination, access to resources. And though the idea of humiliation, discrimination started in the work of the social reformer, it was only by the late 90s that sense of understanding the caste as a system of humiliation and discrimination starts taking place, and it kind of develops in line with the course of nation building and Nehru's agenda of development. So we have gone through the trajectory of conceptualizing caste as ritual status, as a system of domination and exclusion, and also caste as a system of hegemony and descent. So for reference, there are a number of books on caste system, but if we look into these, it will give us a good idea of how to understand caste. The first is Louis Dumont, Homo Hierarchicus, which is a significant work. The second is G.S. Ghore, Caste and Race in India. Third is Surinder Jodhkar, Caste in Contemporary India. Fourth is Paramvijay's introduction in the work Readings in Indian Sociology towards the Sociology of Dalit. And we read these books, we get a good idea of how caste and caste system has been conceptualized in Indian sociology. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.